Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my must-draft running backs for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, on today's episode, I wanted to focus on variables that were often overlooked in fantasy football. One in specific being a thankless position, the offensive line. On a given weekly basis, the offensive line play in front of our running back prospects absolutely determine their potential successes and or failures. So therefore, I wanted to talk about must-draft running backs going into the 2023 season that were associated with elite offensive lines in terms of run blocking grades. So as you guys can see to the right side of the screen, I've collected the top 32 run blocking offensive lines and ranked them as such based on their grades from the 2022 season. This also includes the fact that there's been free agency this offseason, the NFL draft, and of course trades. Now, for those of you who are wondering how I found run blocking grades for rookies, I looked through the history of the last couple seasons based on what round an offensive lineman was drafted in and what run blocking grade they had in their given rookie season, averaged them out amongst all, and then applied it to this upcoming season's rookies. So everything has been well thought out in terms of the run blocking grades. I want to use this rankings list as a kind of predictive measure. And even though there are going to be circumstances of inaccuracies with these given rankings based on the fact that there are going to be injuries in the 18 weeks of the NFL season, some of these offensive linemen are not going to be starting for these teams for an unknown amount of weeks that of course will eventually occur. There are also, the inaccuracies of players improving and or getting worse over time. You get an offensive lineman that is getting older, of course they're going to get worse and their run blocking grade may not be, as great as it was last season. But either way, I want to use this as a predictive measure to determine, of course, which offensive lines have elite play in terms of run blocking and which running backs associated with them have an increased chance of finding success in fantasy football. Now, we are going to be mentioning prospects that are, I would say, controversial at times. Some are rookies, some have dealt with injuries in the past, and some that many of you may not want to draft ever again because of what they've done to you in the past. Now, the reason I specifically say that is because I'm not going to be mentioning running backs like Jonathan Taylor, Josh Jacobs, Nick Chubb, Tony Pollard on today's episode. These are players that you already know you must draft going into this upcoming season. And yes, they are associated with elite tier offensive line play. But we're going to be talking about some more controversial running backs. So before we get into talking about these must-draft running backs, I want to remind you guys, for those of you who have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2023 fantasy football championship. So be sure to go ahead, click that subscribe button. Now, for those of you who are trying to gain an even bigger advantage on your league mates besides the videos and live streams that I post on this channel, be sure to travel to the description and head on over to Underdog Fantasy. Again, for those of you who go ahead, sign up today using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only are you going to get a first-time deposit match up to $100, you're additionally going to receive my 2023 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. This draft guide is filled with hundreds of hours of data and research that I've done this offseason in order to lead you down the right path of selecting your potential prospects in your 2023 drafts. Not only that, the draft rankings include by position, by tier, quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, kickers, and defenses. Top 200 flex, both for half PPR and full PPR rankings. 4-point per passing touchdown, 6-point per passing touchdown. All of this available to you. Additionally, with weekly updated rankings, so regardless of when you draft throughout the entire month of August, you're ready to go. On top of it, the updated weekly rankings aren't just going to stop in the month of August. They'll continue from weeks 1 through 18 every Sunday morning as I'll be sending you updated rankings for all positions by tier, half and full PPR, including flex, which isn't included anywhere on this channel. So if you want to gain an advantage on your league mates and help yourself win a 2023 fantasy football championship, check out Underdog Fantasy, use code Andrew, and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, and you're going to get my support for the entirety of the season. Thank you very much. For those of you who are wondering whether you're eligible, be sure to check out the map to the right of me to determine your eligibility. If you're not eligible, you can also check out my Patreon, link in the description, to find all of the exclusive content that I mentioned somewhere else if in fact Underdog Fantasy is not eligible in your given state. But for those of you who have the eligibility and take the opportunity on hand, be sure to draft responsibly. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about the running back position, couple must-draft players. Let's begin with the Philadelphia Eagles. I understand you see DeAndre Swift on screen, and this is exactly what I was talking about in regards to a couple players that may be controversial going into the 2023 year. But before I talk about DeAndre Swift and his potential, let's talk about what the offensive line presents for him and why he is a valuable prospect just because he's associated with the Philadelphia Eagles offensive line. First and foremost, The continuity of an offensive line is extremely important. And going into this upcoming season, the Philadelphia Eagles have 4 returning starters. Fantastic. Cam Jurgens is the only player that wasn't a starter last season, even though he did start for them. He's a backup center. He could end up winning the job as the right guard this offseason. Time will tell. Now, outside of that, we have studs across this offensive line. In fact, we have, in my opinion, 2 future Hall of Famers in Lane Johnson and Jason Kelce. I almost said Travis Kelce, but yes, his brother Jason Kelce. These guys are 2 future Hall of Famers. The rest of your offensive line is stacked, and they absolutely maul people on a weekly basis. And in my mind, this is what really gives DeAndre Swift an advantage. The association with this offensive line, even though DeAndre Swift is coming from another team that had an elite level offensive line in terms of run blocking, he is filling in a position of need. With Miles Sanders gone, you got to remember, last season, Miles Sanders had 259 rushing attempts, 1,269 rushing yards, and 11 rushing touchdowns within this offense. Overall was the number 13 running back in terms of total fantasy points scored and number 16 in fantasy points per game on average. So in my mind, of course, filling in for Miles Sanders means a lot of opportunity on the ground. Through the air, we know that this offense does not want to throw the ball much, and they may open up to the idea because of what DeAndre Swift presents. But we're talking about a lot of opportunity on the ground. Specifically, last season, we saw Miles Sanders handle 10 or more touches in 16 different games, and he played 50% of the offensive snaps or more in 15 games. Again, there is a huge opportunity for a running back to join this offense and make immediate impact. And as soon as this team traded for DeAndre Swift, the expectation was that he'd be able to fill in and play well. This is an offensive line that ran the ball 368 times to their running backs, which is 16th most amongst all teams in the National Football League in 2020. In terms of rushing yards, 1,745 accumulated by their running backs, 11th most. And in terms of rushing touchdowns, 18 rushing touchdowns, 3rd most amongst all running back groups in the National Football League in 2022. We know that there's elite level offensive line play, but also a lot of opportunity for a running back to succeed. I mean, again, this is a backfield that last season had the opportunity of running the ball in the red zone 71 times. It led to 17 red zone rushing touchdowns. In terms of yards before contact per attempt last season, 3.22 average, which was amongst the highest in the National Football League. This offensive line is not messing around. And when you go ahead and give that opportunity to DeAndre Swift, who in the past has proven himself to be a valuable asset. I mean, you go back to 2022, last season. Prior to his injury, weeks 1 and 2, the guy was averaging 12.5 touches per game and then also scoring 20.35 half PPR fantasy points per game, playing about 60% of the offensive snaps. We know he's capable of production. In fact, even if you go back to 2021, this guy was an effective running back, handling 19 touches per game on average from weeks 1 through 11 prior to his injury, and averaging 15.8 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time in 2021, weeks 1 through 11, was the number 7 overall running back in fantasy football. We know that when they give him opportunity, it leads to success. Now, last season, after he came back from his injuries, only averaging about 10 touches per game, 11 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, averaging only 39% of the offensive snap share. It's not great numbers, yet his efficiency was certainly there. When given opportunity, DeAndre Swift is an elite participant. Last season had an average of 0.88 fantasy points per rushing attempt and 1.24 fantasy points per target. We know that last season, amongst all running backs in the National Football League with a minimum of at least 50 rushing attempts, he ranked 6th in terms of yards per carry, averaging 5.47, and on top of that, averaged 3.1 yards per carry after contact. DeAndre Swift has a lot of upside, and especially considering the fact that you're adding him into an offense that has elite offensive line play, and everyone else with Jalen Hurts, Devonta Smith, of course, A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert, everyone else pulling attention. If DeAndre Swift can just sit there and just enjoy the fruits of his labor of just being associated with this team and getting opportunity on a weekly basis, he's going to be a fantastic fantasy option, currently at an ADP of RB24. Again, there's a lot of hesitation, primarily because of his injury status over the last couple of years. He has had himself at least 3 to 4 missed games due to injuries the last 3 consecutive seasons, which is his entire career. Last season in specific dealt with an AC shoulder injury and an ankle injury. Both of those injuries, of course, causing him to miss a lot of time. And even when he returned, he wasn't fully healthy, and the coaching staff did not give him an ample opportunity at touching the ball a consistent amount of times because Jamal Williams at that point had already gained favor. I truly do believe DeAndre Swift at his current ADP could be the number 1 back of this team. And if he is, we know the upside that is associated purely with that. I mean, last season in the red zone, Miles Sanders had 45 attempts inside the 20-yard line that led to 10 rushing touchdowns. Throughout the last 3 seasons of DeAndre Swift's career, inside the 20-yard line, he only has 17 rushing attempts for 10 rushing touchdowns. Just in one season alone, Miles Sanders was given enough opportunity to outproduce the last 3 seasons of DeAndre Swift's red zone production. There is a lot of upside here, and that is why we mentioned DeAndre Swift. But on the other side of the coin, of course, I have to go ahead. I'd be remiss not to mention Rashaad Penny in regards to this offense. Additionally, he's going to benefit from this offensive line, but understand that Rashaad Penny has also dealt with his own injury history. Since 2018, Rashaad Penny has only played 40 of his eligible 82 regular season games. That certainly isn't a number that we like to see, but he's dealt with a lot of injuries. That is a given. Since 2019, he has only played 9 games of 45% or more of the offensive snaps. Again, not a lot of production. From 2018 through 2022, the first 5 seasons of Rashaad Penny's career, he's accumulated 337 rushing attempts. Last season, Derrick Henry had 349. Even though the wear and tear isn't being applied by the amount of touches he's getting, he still finds himself injured. But don't let all this fool you. He's still an efficient back, and when healthy, he can produce. Since 2021, he's the number 1 running back amongst all running backs with a minimum of 150 rushing attempts in terms of yards per carry after contact per attempt, with a 4.42. Again, that's 4.42 yards after contact per attempt on average. Some running backs in the National Football League don't even average 4 yards per carry, much less he's doing it after contact. Incredible production that we have witnessed from Rashaad Penny over the last couple seasons. I mean, since 2018, in the 16 games where he's been given 10 or more opportunities, he's averaging 15.5 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. In the 9 games in his career where he's been given 15 or more opportunities, averaging 21.02 fantasy points per game. We know that he is a special running back. Last season, averaged 6.07 yards per carry. Number 1 amongst all running backs with 50 or more rushing attempts last season. He's efficient, but can he stay healthy? Currently at an ADP of RB34. That means you'd probably get him in the 10th round. It might be a gamble worth taking, because if he ends up supplanting DeAndre Swift, which I don't see him doing, but if he does, either of these running backs can be extremely valuable purely based on the offense and the offensive line that they're associated with. Therefore, both these guys, in my mind, can be must-draft options for those of you who want a lottery ticket that could end up winning your league at a very low ADP in comparison to some of these other running backs. Moving on. Let's talk about a running back that I may not have to sell you on. Bijan Robinson's current ADP is RB3. So again, I won't have to convince you much, but hopefully the statistics and, of course, the data that I've collected regarding this offensive line, regarding the play calling tendencies of this offense, and of course, Bijan Robinson's skill and what other running backs have produced in this backfield prior to his arrival, hopefully that gives you even more confidence that when you're on the clock and he's the best available prospect, you end up selecting him. So let's talk about this offensive line first and foremost. The Atlanta Falcons offensive line has great continuity going into 2023 as they have 4 returning starters. The only new member is Matthew Bergeron, their rookie left guard. Outside of that, they have incredible prospects, especially on the right side of the line. Caleb McGarry is one of the best run blocking offensive linemen. Well, I guess one of the best run blocking tackles in the National Football League, next to guys like Trent Williams and Christian Darrisaw. Now, in terms of what this offensive line does best, last season, they ran 352 rushing attempts in terms of zone scheme plays. Obviously, with Marcus Mariota there, it's going to be a lot of zone scheme because he had the ability to move, but so does Desmond Ridder. So it doesn't mean they're going to completely avoid the idea of that zone scheme, because last season, in terms of frequency of running outside of the tackles, the Atlanta Falcons were number 1 amongst all teams in the National Football League. Additionally, in terms of what Bijan Robinson did at Texas in 2022, the most frequency of his rushing attempts came from zone scheme runs. So this is a perfect mesh from going from college and joining a professional team that is incredible in terms of run blocking and getting their running back set up for success. So let's talk about Bijan Robinson. Of course, in 2022, his final season at Texas, 258 rushing attempts for 1,580 rushing yards, a 6.12 yard per carry average, 18 rushing touchdowns. Now, these are great college statistics, but I'm not hanging my hat on it. What I really want to hang my hat on is the history of success at the running back position when we talk about running backs who have been drafted as high as Bijan Robinson. In the past decade of the NFL, we have only seen 4 other running backs drafted in the top 8 of their respective NFL draft. Those running backs being Saquon Barkley, Leonard Fournette, Ezekiel Elliott, and Christian McCaffrey. Those running backs in their rookie seasons averaged 262 fantasy points in their given season. Pretty ridiculous statistics. So based on just where Bijan Robinson selected, the talent that we know he has, and now the association with this offensive line, it all leads to his potential success in 2023. Again, this is an offensive line last season that gave their running backs 454 rushing attempts. Behind this offensive line, accumulated the most rushing yards amongst all running backs in the National Football League with 2,207 and 13 rushing touchdowns. The opportunities are certainly going to be there, whether it's, between the 20s or in the red zone. Again, in the red zone last season, this team ran the ball with their running backs 89 times. That led to those 13 rushing touchdowns. Certainly a lot of those opportunities going in the direction of Bijan Robinson being such a talented running back. But even if you don't believe me yet, just think about what Tyler Allgeier did last season. Tyler Allgeier, as a rookie out of BYU, joined this team, wasn't the immediate starter, but eventually, due to injury, supplanted Cordero Patterson. And once he did, he was incredible at the back end of the season. From weeks 15 through 18, Tyler Allgeier demonstrated a lot of success that potentially Bijan Robinson should be able to have himself going into 2023. Tyler Allgeier from weeks 15 through 18 last season averaged 21.25 touches per game and 16.33 fantasy points per game throughout that 4-game span. Additionally, throughout that 4-game span, Desmond Ridder was the starting quarterback. They ran the ball with their running backs 31 times per game throughout those 4 weeks, which was an additional 5.62 on average in comparison to the offenses in which, of course, Marcus Mariota was starting on earlier during the 2022 season. People know that this offense wants to run the ball. They've demonstrated that. There's a reason why Tyler Allgeier last season saw 8 defenders in the box or more, 40% of the snaps that he played. And Cordero Patterson saw 8 defenders or more in the box, 37% of the snaps that he played. Teams know that the Atlanta Falcons want to run the ball. And they're going to do so anyway, and they're going to find success with Bijan Robinson. All right, let's move on to another running back, the thumbnail for today's episode, Alexander Mattison. Besides the fact that he is taking over for Dalvin Cook, he is inheriting the highest graded run blocking offensive line going into the 2023 season. In terms of continuity, have all 5 starters returning this upcoming year. Of course, I mentioned Christian Darrisaw when we were talking about Bijan Robinson because Caleb McGarry is one of the better run blocking offensive linemen. So is Christian Darrisaw. Amongst all left tackles, him and Trent Williams are the best. And they demonstrated that last season. Christian Darrisaw was, when healthy, dominating. But that's the thing. This offensive line needs to stay healthy as they had 12 different players rotate in as starters at one point in this offensive line last season. So health is going to be the determining factor for the success. But as a sidebar, I also want to mention, in terms of free agency this offseason, the Minnesota Vikings went and got Josh Oliver from the Baltimore Ravens. He is, in my opinion, based on grades, based on film, he is the best run blocking tight end in the National Football League. So they stole him, and that's only going to help Alexander Mattison going into this upcoming season. A running back whose current ADP on Underdog Fantasy sits at RB 18. So there are some doubts regarding his potential for success, especially considering the fact that the last 4 seasons of Dalvin Cook's production, RB5, RB3, RB15, and RB10. So why not Alexander Mattison? Sure, he may not be at this talent level of a Dalvin Cook, but the opportunities are certainly going to be there for him going into this upcoming season. And RB 18, in my mind, is his base floor. So let's talk about the Minnesota Vikings offense. Sure, the doubts do loom around Alexander Mattison considering they passed the ball so much last season. 672 passing attempts and only 404 rushing attempts. And amongst all teams in the National Football League, they were 3rd in terms of pass rate. Okay, that does creep in a couple doubts, but 404 rushing attempts, I'm sure we can get enough in the direction of Alexander Mattison to still be an efficient running back. Specifically, last season, 353 of those rushing attempts went to running backs, led to 1,490 rushing yards and 13 rushing touchdowns. Now, in terms of alternative statistics like yards before contact, they averaged 2.48 last season, obviously significantly less than the Philadelphia Eagles. But again, yards before contact is also a running back statistic. If you're getting stuffed in the backfield because you don't have the elusiveness, there is a conversation to be had throughout that spectrum. There are statistics like yards after contact per attempt. These statistics matter because both the running back position and offensive lines, efforts contribute to it. So it's not just a running back stat or it's not just an offensive line stat. Keep that in mind. Now, with this all covered, I do want to mention once again a couple of the quotes that we've heard from the offensive coordinator and the head coach this offseason of the Minnesota Vikings. I mentioned this during my top 24 running back rankings video. For those of you who haven't checked that out, be sure to do so. Again, the head coach has mentioned Alexander Mattison being a 3-down back. Additionally, the offensive coordinator came out and said maybe people didn't realize how good of a player Alexander Mattison really is. They're going to give him 3-down work. And sure, they're going to see sprinkles of other running backs in this backfield, just like how Mattison was when Cook was active. But it's not going to derail his entire season because Alexander Mattison has demonstrated that he is an efficient player when given opportunity. From 2020 through 2021, when Alexander Mattison at any point played 48% or more of the offensive snaps. He averaged 23 touches per game and 17.7 half PPR fantasy points per game. Additionally, in those 7 games that he played, where he was given 48% or more of the offensive snaps, he was averaging 4.3 yards per carry and 3.03 yards after contact per attempt. Now, in the 6 career starts that Alexander Mattison has had, he's averaging 19.5 attempts per game and 18.13 fantasy points per game. Anytime from 2020 through 2021, he's been given 10 or more rushing attempts, he's averaging 16.35 fantasy points per game. He is an efficient running back, and in an offense that is behind the best graded run blocking offensive line with the best run blocking tight end in the National Football League, I expect Alexander Mattison to find a lot of success here, and for the absence of Dalvin Cook to not be as major as a lot of people are making it out to be. All right, moving on. Let's talk about J.K. Dobbins, a running back that many of you wondered, Andrew, where is he on your top 24 rankings? There's a lot of questions regarding and revolving around J.K. Dobbins at this current moment in time. He is on the PUP list, which is physically unable to perform, and he has also been quoted to have been frustrated with his contract and not renewing a new one this offseason. So we're going to go ahead and we'll get there. But let's go ahead and let's begin by talking about this offensive line and why his immediate association with it makes him a potential must-draft candidate. Again, this offensive line has a pretty good continuity of starters coming back, 4 of the 5, the only one being their left guard, which is a rookie that may not even win the job. We'll end up seeing what happens throughout training camp here. But at this current moment in time, pretty good continuity and pretty good run blocking threats, especially Morgan Moses. He is one of the better run blocking tackles in the National Football League. And as long as you're going to continue to run it to the right, J.K. Dobbins will find his success. But like I mentioned, J.K. Dobbins has a lot of question marks currently revolving around him. And without answers, it is going to be difficult to determine his potential for success. This all being said, we know he is an efficient player and he is a fantastic running back. If and when healthy, fantastic. We know that he had his grade 3 ACL tear back in August of 2021. He missed the entirety of that season, came back in 2022, didn't look healthy, and then went ahead and had another procedure on his knee, then returned. And once he did return last season from weeks 14 through the NFL playoffs, the guy was averaging 15 touches per game and 13 fantasy points per game and averaging 6.56 yards per carry. And this was all while he was limping down the field and didn't have the greatest lateral movement. Just taking that into account, this is a running back last season throughout that span of time, weeks 14 through the playoffs, was averaging 0.74 fantasy points per attempt, was averaging 13 fantasy points per game anytime he was given 10 or more rushing attempts, was averaging 3.33 yards after contact per attempt. Pretty good statistics for someone who was coming off of an injury. And even though he wasn't given an incredible amount of red zone opportunities, but he certainly will see that number rise this upcoming season with Lamar Jackson back. And of course, this offense being in the red zone far more often. But in terms of efficiency, like I mentioned earlier, with a 6.56 yards per carry average throughout that span of time, in 2020, his rookie season, he averaged 6 yards per carry throughout the entirety of that year. He's one of 6 running backs since 2010 to be able to accomplish that with a minimum of 100 or more rushing attempts. That is a ridiculous statistic to try to keep up with. I mean, we're talking about running backs like CJ Spiller that J.K. Dobbins is being associated with in that category. Now, besides his individual skill, a lot of that efficiency can be attributed to this offensive line. This offensive line has led to a boatload of kind of no-name running backs being effective. I mean, we talk about guys like Kenyon Drake, Latavius Murray, and Devontae Freeman in the last 2 seasons still being running backs that are averaging over 4.2 yards per carry on average despite being on their last legs. Additionally, we have seen Gus Edwards from 2018 through 2020, every single one of those seasons averaging over 5 yards per carry. Mark Ingram back in 2019 averaged 5 yards per carry. In 2020 was just barely shy of reaching that number. This is, of course, a run-first attack, and teams know that they want to run the ball. There's a reason why last season J.K. Dobbins faced 8 defenders in the box, 36% of the snaps that he played. Kenyon Drake, even last season, 35% of the snaps he played had 8 defenders in the box. When you go up against the Baltimore Ravens with mobile quarterbacks, of course, they have to stack the box. But even with this all being the case, this offensive line has been able to demonstrate that they're able to open up some gaps and allow these running backs to run free and find a lot of success in doing so. Now, when we go into 2023, the play calling is going to be different with Todd Monken there instead of Greg Roman. When you look back at Todd Monken's offensive coordinator stint with the Cleveland Browns in 2019, he gave his running backs the 11th most rushing attempts, 358 in that given season. So we know he can give the running back position a good amount of opportunities. It's just a matter of whether or not we are going to see J.K. Dobbins healthy and ready to go. We have heard, of course, not only he's on the PUP list, we've heard that there may be some dissatisfaction with his contract negotiations going on. We even heard John Harbaugh, the head coach of this team, make some comments when asked about J.K. Dobbins that didn't make me too confident. We know that he can absolutely be a top 24 player, and that's why he is a must-draft option if and when he gets off that PUP list and he's back to practicing and demonstrate he can be healthy, because we know that a year after your ACL injury, you're not going to immediately be the player you used to be. It usually takes that second season to where we've seen running backs find success. I mean, when you go back to 2015, running backs who have in that second season found success, Saquon, Rashaad Penny, Dalvin Cook, Dion Lewis, were all top 36 in that second year after the ACL injury. Everybody else outside of that obviously did not return to play or did not return to play at a high level. So those guys are in the minority, and so would J.K. Dobbins be going into this upcoming season. But I truly do believe he has the talent, the skill, and the offensive line to get him to that point. Let's move on to the final team that we wanted to talk about. And let's talk about David Montgomery. David Montgomery is associated with an offensive line that has 4 returning starters. The only new one is Vaitai sitting at the right guard position. He was a part of this team, but obviously had a season-ending surgery last year, so he wasn't the primary starter for the majority of the season. Otherwise, this is one of the best offensive lines in terms of run blocking in the National Football League. And when you add David Montgomery into this conversation, the fact that he currently sits at an ADP of RB23 is a little bit confusing, because from what we have heard and what we have seen this organization accomplish in 2022 and going into this offseason, and even the comments that we have heard from Dan Campbell, everything points towards David Montgomery being a valuable option. This is a quote from Dan Campbell. "I think you need a back that when push comes to shove, he can carry the load. Somebody that we can feel we can give the ball 20 to 25 times a game potentially. And then you need a specialty guy that you know he's much more. You know he carries a scalpel and can slice you up. He can hurt you in the passing game. Potentially, I'm talking about Gibbs, obviously. Get him out there for a few more things, etc. So yeah, I do see a two-headed monster here." That was his whole quote. So he's talking about giving a primary back potentially 20 to 25 carries, and then having the specialty guy, which would be Jahmyr Gibbs, getting involved in the passing game, of course, getting himself some rushing attempts. But you got to remember, as long as David Montgomery is going to be that, hey, I'm carrying the load for this team running back, carrying the ball 15 to 20 times a game, he's filling in for Jamal Williams. And we know what Jamal Williams was capable of and what he accomplished last season with 262 rushing attempts, 1,066 rushing yards. Obviously wasn't efficient, but still had himself 17 rushing touchdowns. When given the high-level opportunities on the goal line, I mean, it led to him being the number 8 overall ranked running back last season in fantasy football half PPR, while only playing 40.28% of the offensive snaps. We know this team wants to run the ball. They gave their running backs the 6th most rushing attempts with 426 that led to 1,880 rushing yards and 23 rushing touchdowns, which was number 1 amongst all teams in the National Football League last season. Jamal Williams had 11 games in which he had 15 or more rushing attempts. Anytime throughout David Montgomery's career, he's had 15 or more rushing attempts. He's averaging 14.9 half PPR fantasy points per game. And despite all the doubts with Jahmyr Gibbs being there and David Montgomery and his injuries of the past, David Montgomery has low-key been durable. Since 2020, he's one of 5 running backs who has played over 2,000 offensive snaps. One of 5 running backs. Even though he has missed time at the running back position, there is not a lot of durability. And the fact that David Montgomery has been able to establish said durability by playing as many snaps as he had, it really does make a huge difference. And I truly do believe with the opportunities that are going to be granted to him, especially down in the red zone filling in for this Jamal Williams role. Jamal Williams literally had 45 rushing attempts inside the 10-yard line last season. That was number 1 amongst all running backs, which led to 15 rushing touchdowns, number 1 amongst all running backs. In that same offense, Jared Goff inside the 10-yard line, 44 passing attempts, that was 5th amongst all quarterbacks, and 20 passing touchdowns, 2nd amongst all quarterbacks. This team down in the red zone is incredible. And to be honest, they're going to continue to get down there as this team only improves. I really do believe that David Montgomery, his current ADP at RB23, is a huge discount that you can have for a running back that is far more capable than what people give him credit for. All right, the only other running back that I wanted to mention is Jahmyr Gibbs. I do think that Jahmyr Gibbs at the right price is a must-draft candidate. At his current ADP of RB12, it is very rich for my blood. But I will say, in the quote in which Dan Campbell, said, of course, we need a guy that is a specialist, someone who carries a scalpel, who can, slice you up, specifically in the passing game. That exactly represents Jahmyr Gibbs. But what it also reminds me of is the 2017 New Orleans Saints. The reason why I bring up the New Orleans Saints, because it's kind of random, is that Dan Campbell was an assistant head coach of that team and the tight ends coach. And he watched, Sean Payton absolutely tear it up with two running backs, a two-headed monster of sorts with Alvin Kamara and, of course, Mark Ingram. In that season, both those running backs were top 6 and dominated. Obviously, Alvin Kamara in that year had to score himself double-digit touchdowns, get himself 80 receptions and 800-plus receiving yards, while also being a dominant running back with 6 yards per carry plus. All those things are capable and potentially in line for Jahmyr Gibbs because he's a talented enough back. A lot of people even compare him to Alvin Kamara. I can see it in the way that they run. They just look so much alike because of that elbow tape. I'm telling you, that is the biggest difference maker. And of course, the hair that's kind of flowing around. But both these guys, they don't take big hits. They're extremely elusive, and that's why there's been a lot of comparisons between the two, and potentially Jahmyr Gibbs kind of filling in for that kind of a role within this offense, which obviously they wanted to give DeAndre Swift in seasons past, but he wasn't durable enough to go ahead and maintain that. That all being said, there is a potential in which Jahmyr Gibbs behind this offensive line, obviously with a lot of receiving help, can get there. When you look at the last decade of football, there have been 5 running backs that have been selected in the top 12. Barkley, Fournette, Elliott, McCaffrey, and Gurley. Those running backs averaged about 250 fantasy points and a half PPR their rookie season. If we can end up seeing it, of course, 250 fantasy points is easily going to surpass RB12 in a half PPR setting, in that he would crush his current ADP. But if we're not going to see upwards of 70-plus receptions and double-digit touchdowns for someone like Jahmyr Gibbs, because we're seeing David Montgomery get himself receiving work because we know he's capable of doing so, and of course, the potential of those touchdowns not going in the right direction, Jahmyr Gibbs may be a lower valued guy, but at very least, he is a top 24 prospect. He will get himself over 150 rushing attempts. He will get himself 40 receptions, which since 2019, we have seen 45 running backs out of 47 be top 24 producers when given 150 rushing attempts and 40 receptions. So we know at a base minimum, he's going to be an RB2. He has the potential of course, being an incredible option behind this offensive line in an offense that's associated with, wanting to get their running backs heavily involved. Just giving you my thoughts once again on Jahmyr Gibbs. Could be a must-draft candidate, but man, that ADP is so rich. Hopefully in your leagues and, separate from an Underdog Fantasy ADP, he may go a little bit later, and if he does, could be a fantastic option. That's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Those were my must-draft running backs associated with offensive lines that are elite in terms of run blocking. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you have not yet already, be sure to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel for daily fantasy football content. The final thing I need to mention is, of course, if you are trying to gain an advantage on your league mates, be sure to go ahead, click on the link down in the description, and travel over to Underdog Fantasy. Again, at this current moment in time, if you use code ANGEL to sign up and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, you get my fantasy football draft guide, the rankings that are associated with it, updated every single week, along with weekly Sunday morning rankings from my email to yours that has all positions, all tiers, half PPR, full PPR, flex, so that you can help yourself win a 2023 fantasy football championship. So help me help you. Sign up today, make that first-time deposit, and go ahead and start drafting. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.